Welcome to MS Research Australia's Research Report. I'm Dr. Hamish Campbell, and in this series we explore the research that's going on in Australia and around the world. Just recently we're at Darwin for the Australian and New Zealand Association of Neurologists Conference. There we met up with Professor Gavin Giovannoni, who is a world-renowned expert on MS. We chatted to him about the research priorities and what he sees to be the next important areas in MS research.
Depends where you live in the world. If you live in the United Kingdom, it's adoption of innovations. It's actually applying the evidence base we've got to the clinical situation, and the reasons for that are multiple. We've got a very low penetration of disease-modifying therapy prescribing, and we don't have enough active monitoring and escalation to more effective therapies. In Australia, it's a little bit different. The neurologists in Australia seem to be more aggressive in terms of trying to treat the disease very actively. And so there's a much higher proportion of patients on treatment in Australia versus other countries, and a much higher proportion on what we would call more effective therapies, which I think the Australian situation is probably correct. So the unmet need is treating people effectively. The other thing we have a problem with is treating to target, and so we're trying to adopt this approach from the rheumatology field, where we actually try and suppress all inflammation and we treat to target. Our current target is needed, no evident disease activity, but I think we need to go beyond that. We need to start targeting end organ damage, so trying to prevent the brain from shrinking, brain atrophy, trying to suppress all inflammation, and then also promoting lifestyle issues. So, how do we maximize brain health for people when they get older, because people with multiple sclerosis are going to get old. And so it's trying to get the community behind this strategy of brain health. So to achieve those goals with research is actually to maybe compare a more aggressive, more active treatment approach versus standard of care. I think it's very difficult to do that in a randomized trial, simply because I don't think there's equipoise. I think there's enough data out there to support the more effective management strategy. But you can do it using real-life data sets. In Australia, as you know, there's MS base, and hidden in MS base there will be people more actively managed versus people more passively managed. You could compare outcomes of people with disease across countries. So you could compare what happens in Australia and Sweden, which are the two countries which are, in my opinion, where MS is managed more actively, versus the UK and, say, other countries where it's less actively managed. So that's what you could do to generate an evidence base. And I think the MS community will respond to real-life data, because we realize that it's very difficult to do that trial. So if you've got multiple sclerosis, you obviously got to treat the MS effectively and switch it off, to be honest with you, because we know that MS reduces brain reserve, and what protects us from age-related cognitive impairment is cognitive reserve, which is our education, for example, environmental enrichment, and the brain size. And we know that MS reduces both those. So you've got to treat the MS. Outside of MS, you've got to do what's been shown in the dementia field. It's basically make sure you get good sleep. Sleep deprivation is a big issue. Make sure you're healthy in terms of your diet, exercise. So exercise has probably got the biggest evidence base behind it. You've got to avoid certain medications. We're now beginning to realize that anticholinergic drugs, so these are antihistamines over the counter, for example, and there's a large number of anticholinergic therapies that increase your risk of Alzheimer's or dementia. So we should probably dial down what we call the anticholinergic drug loading in people with MS, for example. And then comorbidities. People shouldn't smoke. We know that smoking is a major risk factor for MS, plus making the disease worse. So how do you get people to stop smoking? That's very, very difficult. And then you've got to make sure we treat hypertension, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, metabolic syndrome. All these things reduce brain reserve. I think over the last 10 years, our most important insights is into the mechanisms that drive progressive disease. And I think we're now beginning to realize that MS is driven almost entirely by inflammatory activity early on in the disease, and it's really early on in the disease. Most of the damage occurs within the first 5 years. And we know that from the Queen Square Clinical Isolated Syndrome study, it's the damage that occurs early that predicts long-term outcome. And so if we can stop that inflammatory activity early on, we can improve outcomes. If we wait longer and people acquire this damage, it's impossible. At the moment, it's not easy to fix that damage. So I think that's important. I mean, there was this hypothesis that MS could be a neurodegenerative disease and that the inflammation was secondary. I think all the clinical data now that's coming out would argue against that. So I think that's the insight. It's driven by inflammation. What else have we discovered in the last year? I think the epidemiology around Epstein-Barr virus as a possible cause is become more and more compelling. I mean, there are no studies that have emerged to disprove the hypothesis, and I think that's really important now that we know that, to target Epstein-Barr virus as a preventive strategy and possibly as a treatment strategy. We still haven't shown how EBV causes MS. Is it simply the trigger early on, what I would call hit and run, or is EBV responsible for driving inflammatory activity? And the only way we're going to dissect that out is by targeting the virus with specific antiviral therapies, which is one of the unmet needs in MS research, is developing drugs that target Epstein-Barr virus. Specifically, interestingly, the emergence of anti-CD20, which is a new class of drug in MS, those are potent anti-EBV drugs. Actually, the only licensed therapy for Epstein-Barr virus is a drug called rituximab, which was the first anti-CD20. And that actually is very effective in treating MS. So I think we've got insights from our mode of action of our disease-modifying therapies that also support the Epstein-Barr virus hypothesis. That's what I call the bookmarks. So relapsing-remitting MS in terms of disease-modifying therapy is pretty well addressed, and what we really need is policy initiatives to make sure that those patients get found and treated properly in that space. Where we really should be targeting is prevention strategies and trying to get patients into the clinical pathways as quickly as possible. And so I would focus on prevention, and that requires an international effort because the trials have to be large, very well done, and they have to have long-term follow-up, so they need enormous resource over many, many decades, to be honest with you. And the other big unmet need is people with more advanced disease, and so that's what we would call progressive disease. I prefer to use the term advanced because this idea of referring to MS as multiple diseases doesn't make any sense biological. It's one disease, but you either have early or intermediate or late phase disease, and I think we need to focus on late phase disease. What can we do to improve the quality of life and at least slow down the worsening of the progression later on? So that's protection strategies, remyelination, restorative strategies that need to focus on the more advanced patients.
Thank you for watching part 1 of our interview with Professor Gavin Giovannoni. Make sure you tune in to part 2 where we talk about the Brain Health Initiative and also his patients checklist to help people with MS participate more in their own care. If you want more information, make sure you go to our website, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Dr. Hamish Campbell, and I'll see you next time.